Good morning to those of you on the West Coast, and good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. Welcome to the UCLA Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for the Study of Hellenic Culture. My name is Sharon Gerstel, and I'm happy to introduce our final public event for 2021. This event is co-sponsored by the Embassy of Greece in Washington. Throughout this important year, it has been our absolute pleasure to work with the Ambassador of Greece, Her Excellency Alexandra Papadopoulou, and with Cultural Attaché Connie Mourtoupalas on events that have drawn hundreds of listeners from the United States, Canada, and also from Greece. It is fitting that we conclude our lectures on 1821 with today's talk, which focuses attention on American Philhellenism and the role of philhellenes in supporting the Greek Revolution. But I should say, this is not our last 1821 event. Because of COVID, we have rescheduled a new theatrical performance, Makrianis Unplugged, adapted, directed, and performed by acclaimed actor Yorgos Karamichos until the spring. Makrianis Unplugged will premiere at UCLA on March 26th in the Frood Theater at 7 p.m. before traveling to Vancouver, Toronto, and Athens in early and mid-April. I hope you will be able to join us for this impactful theatrical experience. And now I would like to invite our friend, Ambassador of Greece to the United States, Alexandra Papadopoulou, to make some opening remarks, after which I will return to introduce today's speaker. Your Excellency, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kerstel, and greetings to everybody in the East Coast, West Coast, and around the world who happen to watch this program. Once again, and especially as the year draws to a close, I am pleased to join the UCLA Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for the Study of Hellenic Culture for our last collaboration for 2021. A year in which the Center has hosted a large number of lectures and performances linked to the bicentennial celebration of the Greek Revolution. We will continue our collaboration, of course, well into 2022. I personally wait with great anticipation for March 26, 2022, when the acclaimed Greek actor Yorgos Karamichos will be performing Makrianis Unplugged at UCLA, before presenting this important new work in Vancouver, Toronto, Athens, and elsewhere. And I hope to be there to have the opportunity to watch this performance myself. I am very grateful to the Center for partnering this year with the Embassy on so many wonderful events, and I look forward to working together in the future, especially for the celebration of National Poetry Month on April 16. Which we will feature Roderick Beaton lecturing on Yorgos Seferis, one of the most important Greek poets of the 20th century, a Nobel laureate, and I'm happy and honored to say, a career diplomat in the Greek Foreign Service. With today's lecture by Professor Maureen Santelli, we turn from our consideration of the role of Greeks in the revolution to the role of Americans as supporters and fundraisers. Support for the Greeks was a shared effort among a broad American audience, and this is especially noteworthy given that the decade of 1820s was the time in which America increasingly experienced sectional tension between the North and the South. What was it about the efforts of the Greek Revolution that united Americans across society and regions, and what can we say about the different levels of engagement for supporting the Greeks across American society? In this study, looking at Greek-American relations over 200 years, we celebrate the warm and sustained relationship of our two countries, our two peoples, whose common values have ensured an enduring friendship. Thank you.
Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Professor Maureen Santelli, a Montana native, completed her master's and PhD at George Mason University in Virginia, close to the embassy in Washington. She has held fellowships at George Washington's Mount Vernon, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and the Library Company of Philadelphia. She has also worked with the National Park Service as an interpreter and historian. Currently, she is Associate Professor of History at Northern Virginia Community College, where she teaches United States history, Western civilization, and world history courses. Her recent book, The Greek Fire, American-Ottoman Relations and Democratic Fervor in the Age of Revolutions, examines the rise of Philhellenism in the United States and how the movement influenced both foreign and domestic policies during the early American Republic. She has also published an important article, Depart from That Retired Circle, Women's Support of the Greek War for Independence, and Antebellum Reform in Early American Studies, an interdisciplinary journal. And she is currently working on a study of Lascarina Bubolina for a volume that is edited by April Householder. Professor Santelli has lectured widely this year on American Philhellenism and the Greek Revolution, and we are very fortunate to have her with us today. Following her lecture, please feel free to write your questions or comments in the chat box, and I will read them, or raise your hands, and will ask you to unmute yourself, so that you can ask your questions directly. Finally, let me just say that this lecture is part of our HUC at UCLA series, indicating that it is part of the offerings of the Hellenic University Club, an active group of educated Greeks and Philhellenes in Los Angeles who have entrusted the ongoing offerings of their organization to the UCLA SNF Hellenic Center. We are very grateful to have this club and their members as part of our community. So with greatest thanks to Ambassador Papadopoulou for her kind words of introduction, let me now, please, on behalf of both of us, welcome Professor Maureen Santelli for the Grassroots Mobilization of American Philhellenism. Professor Santelli.
Thank you so much, Sharon, UCLA Ambassador, for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and especially since out of all of the talks that I have done this year, this actually will be the first time that I am getting to speak specifically just about the Grassroots organization, their efforts to support the Greeks, what exactly that looked like. So I'm excited to lay that out. How I decided to organize this is to organize around questions that people tend to have about the Philhellenic movement. What were people actually doing to organize all of this? So I'm going to kind of go back and forth between quoting the people from the period and asking these questions. So, and I actually have a PowerPoint that I'm going to get going here. So let me just share my screen. Sorry about that. Here we are. So I want to begin with just kind of setting the scene. What were early Americans doing almost 200 years ago in supporting the Greeks? So this is what was going on in New York with just Philhellenic organizational efforts. From mid-December 1823 to Washington's birthday in 1824, American communities, large and small, planned public events designed to financially support the Greek Revolution. A carnival-like atmosphere energized the city of New York the week before Christmas as, quote, a most noble and patriotic spirit prevailed on the subject of the Greek cause. Everybody seems disposed to do something, observed the New York commercial advertiser. The theater, the circus, the forum, and the lions and tigers all give the Greeks a benefit, which it sort of makes me laugh thinking about the lions and tigers, like almost consciously supporting the Greeks here. Philadelphia planned a fancy dress ball with about 100 ladies and gentlemen expected to attend from New York. Boston planned a similar event, and there's some cooperative coordination there going on between the cities. Churches held special services that included sermons addressing the worthiness of the Greek cause, where, quote, ladies as well as gentlemen were respectfully solicited to attend. In Alexandria, then in the District of Columbia, and even a little town of Petersburg, Virginia, citizens came together to celebrate Washington's birthday in February, devoting that day not only to George Washington's memory, but also to raising funds for the Greeks. So this is just one of many examples that I could have provided to you, and just sort of setting the tone, setting the stage for just the widespread enthusiasm for the Greek cause and raising aid for their benefit. But how did this come about? Why would early Americans care so much about Greek independence? What is that really all about? And sort of like from the core of my research, how I approached looking at this topic was I wanted to write about what motivated early Americans, how did they see themselves in connection with this event or these events? How did they see the modern Greeks? How did they see the Ottoman Turks? And how does this help us to understand their thought process? So why the Greeks? First of all, since the end of the 18th century, with their own revolution, they had been trying to intellectually identify with a different past. So they'd been distancing themselves from their Britishness, if we want to call it that. So rather than trying to have a British ancestry, we see early Americans trying to identify their history more with an ancient tradition. At first, this is predominantly the ancient Roman Republic, which newspapers, even the debates concerning the Constitutional Convention, a lot of this is framed in the context of antiquity, but specifically the Roman Republic, not so much Greece. So how do we end up then with an increasingly sympathetic view towards the Greeks? Because the founding fathers were deeply concerned about using democracy in its purest sense. They felt that this devolved into possibility for mob rule. By the 1820s, we see a movement in the United States where there is much mobilization for increasing the population of who can actually vote. Now, from our modern standpoint, this does not seem very progressive, but when we consider that the number of people who could legally vote in the late 18th century, it's just property holding white men. So by the 1820s, there is this effort to change voting laws and allow for universal white male suffrage. So that's one way in which we see this greater interest in democracy. We also see this interest in classical traditions shifting towards more of a Greek tradition. This has a bit of an exotic flair, partly due to archaeological discoveries in the Mediterranean. Most notably would include Napoleon's conquest of the Mediterranean at the turn of the 19th century. And then, of course, probably most famously, Thomas Bruce, Earl of Elgin's acquisition in 1812 of the Parthenon marbles from Ottoman officials in Athens. And this is going to captivate the imaginations of not just Europeans in terms of where do these antiquities come from, the people that created them, but early Americans are also very much engaged in this conversation, and specifically with whether it was appropriate for the Earl of Elgin to remove the Parthenon marbles from Athens, should Britain legally be allowed to keep these. And of course, there's debates within Parliament as well as amongst European and American philhellenes. In addition, Lord Byron's poetry, Lord Byron himself, with his enthusiasm for Greece, his travels to Greece, his famous poem, Childe Harold, all of this inspired an increasing interest in Greece. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson's probably the earliest American philhellene, writing as early as the 1780s about this desire for Greece to have independence from the Ottoman Empire. There's also, of course, this dichotomy in perspective, the Greeks seem like this wholly worthy group of people who should have independence, especially given the fact that they are under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. And I'll speak more about that in just a bit. Still other factors that must be considered as part of the American Philhellenic experience is through the prism of religion and race. For many Americans, especially those in New England, with enthusiasm for foreign missions at this time, the Greek Revolution was not only a war to revive the glories of ancient Greece, but was also a religious war. American ministers combined efforts with Philhellenic organizers, infusing religious rhetoric with the patriotic. These joint efforts helped to expand the list of donors and effectively laid the groundwork for an evolving American Philhellenic movement that became more clearly defined as the war continued. News reports and Philhellenic speeches emphasized the difference between the Greeks and the Ottoman Turks, the Turks as they would have called them, not only noting that the Greeks were Christian, but also on the basis of race. One news report stated the Hellenic race was an illustrious one and worthy of support. Yet another report asked its readers, quote, would not every arm be uplifted to snatch so large a portion of our race from being consigned by their ruthless oppressors to slavery, dishonor, and death? So what's going on with this slide first before I continue? There was a prevailing feeling that classical statuary from ancient Greece, usually more specifically from the Hellenistic age, but also copies made during the Roman period, that this exemplified the finest, not only the finest element of or examples of art in the world, but also came to represent by the 19th century this perspective on the ideal form of human beauty. And the Apollo Belvedere, the statue, which is actually, it's now thought to be perhaps a recreation of a Hellenistic statue, but it is Roman in origin. But in the 19th century, they thought that it was a Greek statue, that this embodied the ideal human form of beauty. And it was used to contrast that vision with a supposed sense of differences within the races. And obviously this is an extremely racist perspective on different groups in the world, but the discussion about the Greek people, their connection with ancient Greece, why Americans should support the Greeks, it took on an element of this racial tone. And this is perhaps one reason why the southern part of the United States so wholly supported Greek independence. And I'll speak more about that in just a moment. On the left, this is a page from a book called The Types of Mankind by Knott and Glidden. It is categorizing races. Obviously, the meaning is blaring us right in the face of what sort of connection they're trying to make between African Americans and apes. And in comparing it, the conclusion we're of course supposed to come to is that they are so different from whites and from the ancient standard of beauty. So though early Americans sometimes classify the Greeks as being of a unique race, or even one they shared, the consensus was that the modern Greeks were a people worthy of support. Philhellenes described the Ottomans, on the other hand, as, quote, a race of merciless and incorrigible barbarians whose ignorance, fanaticism, brutality, and ferocity render them enemies of mankind and fit objects of execration to all civilized nations. These reports frequently referred to the Ottomans as being part of a race of infidels or barbarians, suggesting that they were set apart from the civilized world and perhaps from the human race as a whole. So again, we have to understand that this is part of the conversation, even if it's not being overtly stated within American circles, it is certainly there. So what were the opinions early Americans had towards the Muslim world? And what's interesting about this question is that there isn't actually one single answer to this, because they did have a diverse perspective, although generally speaking, they viewed the Muslim world with suspicion and dislike. So first of all, in terms of religion, and this we can look at this going back to the constitutional debates, where questions about whether there should be a religion test involved in being able to serve in an elected office. They actually discuss how would we feel if a Muslim were elected to a federal office. Ultimately, those who were not in favor of a religious test prevailed and won the argument, but there still was this conversation about whether Muslims, and actually they also categorized Roman Catholics in the same category, that Muslims cannot be wholly capable of serving in public office within a republic because their loyalties are divided, that they have to defer to Muhammad, to their specific faith. And the same thing with the Roman Catholicism. Their attitude was that they couldn't be wholly devoted to the republic because of the Pope. So, very similar, again, misguided attitudes, but that's still very much part of their perspective, how they come to see the Muslim world. In addition, the Ottoman Empire, it was viewed as a despotic one because it's under the authority of the Sultan. And I'll go ahead and flip this up here. They also, though, viewed the Muslim world with intrigue. They enjoyed the perceived exoticism of the Middle East, as we call it today. This is a page from Arabian Nights Entertainments. This was a very popular book. This is, of course, 1001 Nights, right? Or Arabian Nights. It's known by all those titles. This is a copy printed in 1822. This was extremely popular. So while they view the Muslim world with suspicion, still love reading stories that have to deal with that part of the world. And so we see this with the King of the Genie on the right here. One motivating factor, especially for women, and why they're going to be so engrossed in supporting the Greek cause, is this perspective of the harem that prevailed in the 18th and 19th centuries. This image, by the way, is a painting that's from the later part of the 19th century. This is not an image that early Americans would have been familiar with, but the reason why I'm using it is it encapsulates the attitudes that early Americans express over and over and over, this feeling that women are absolutely subjugated within the Ottoman Empire, that the harem is the ultimate example of the degradation and mistreatment of women within the Ottoman Empire, and the feeling that if we don't support the Greeks in their effort to free themselves from the Ottomans, this is what's happening to Greek Christian young women, that they are being enslaved, perhaps brought into the harem, similarly to how we see how this poor young woman is depicted in the center here. So that is certainly a motivating factor. And again, I'll circle back to that actually in a little bit. Also, the Barbary Wars is one element of where the Americans have experience with encountering the Muslim world. The Barbary Wars resulted in the captivity of a number of American sailors and even civilians. Captivity tales were a sensationalized line or genre of literature that was extremely popular in the United States for quite a long time. Some of these books are based on firsthand accounts. They're considered to be based on actual people's experiences, but quite a number of them are fictionalized. This is an illustration from likely a fictionalized account, the history of the captivity and sufferings of Mrs. Maria Martin, who also is supposed to be, by the way, British, although this was printed in the United States by American printers many times. So this image here showing Mrs. Maria Martin in chains is sort of a similar image in some ways to what we see in this one. So again, the Muslims, the Muslim world, the Ottoman Empire specifically, as being, in their perception, the most despotic empire in the world in the history of mankind, and with this connection to the ancient world, of course, early Americans are going to want to support the Greeks. But how does this compare with support for other revolutions? Because this, of course, is the age of revolutions. There are a number of other revolutions taking place throughout the world. We, of course, have the French Revolution. There is the revolution in South America led by Simón Bolívar and others. So how does support for the Greek Revolution compare to all of this? In fact, and I looked into this to see if this isn't really exceptional. Perhaps the early Americans supported all revolutions similarly and equally, but that's just not the case. Revolutions did generate interest. Americans felt that if it meant the creation of more republics in the world, this is certainly something that they wanted to have happen. At the end of the day, for the French Revolution, even with Simón Bolívar, there is this lot of engagement and even some interest in raising funds, but not at all on the scale that we see with the Greek Revolution, and certainly not as long of a sustained interest. The Greek Revolution excites interest for almost 10 years. So some examples here that I want to provide. One individual wrote an article in a newspaper. This is somebody who had supported Simón Bolívar, had really advocated for Americans to send aid. And in this article that they printed, they're really frustrated because people are so much more interested in the Greek Revolution. So he says this in disbelief. He says, "Our diary of news details repeated resolutions by our Southern brethren to support the cause of religious and civil liberty among the Greeks. And the same popular sentiment has excited our own citizens to make a common cause. Convinced that citizens should be more concerned with successful revolutions in their own hemisphere, this is going to be beneficial to us diplomatically. Wouldn't it be better to have local allies that have successful republics? But ultimately, this author conceded the favorite theme is Greece and her suffering people. And he sort of reluctantly acknowledges that this is just seems to be something that's insurmountable. People are more interested in supporting the Greeks, even though they're so far away, and a place that most Americans probably are not going to travel to, and would not, in his estimation anyway, benefit the United States commercially or diplomatically for that matter. Greek committees collected funds not only from Philhellenic elites within the community, but also from church groups, benevolent groups, and tradesmen. Some of the charitable efforts of these groups were ambitious, indicating just how widespread and enthusiastic the cause was early on in the war. One question that I get a lot about is, well, what about the Serbian Revolution? Wouldn't that just generate the same thing? Isn't supporting the Greeks just a religious motivated endeavor? And the answer is no. It absolutely is this perceived connection in terms of identity, politics, And that, again, that connection with antiquity, that early Americans believed that they were tied with the modern Greeks. Yes, there was some interest in the Serbian Revolution. There are articles that are printed in newspapers that follow the revolution, but it just did not generate the same kind of enthusiasm or the raising of similar funds. So again, it isn't just the religious aspect, although absolutely it is part of it. So how did the movement in the US actually get its start? Well, that we have to credit a lot to Lord Byron, although he doesn't get all the credit. Again, there are indications that there already was a feeling in the United States going back to the late 1700s even, that Greece should have independence from the Ottoman Empire. But Lord Byron and his exploits in Greece, his poetry, the romanticization of ancient Greece through his poetry. Here he's, of course, romantically depicted in Albanian dress in 1813. Lord Byron, of course, goes on to serve in the Greek army. I'll speak more about that in just a moment. But it's Lord Byron's activity that's born out of this romantic sensibility about Greece's past that energizes a lot of early Americans. And the early part of the American Philhellenic movement is in some ways very focused on the sentimental and romantic. From 1821 to probably 1823, so almost 2 years, there are efforts to raise funds, although a lot of what is said and printed in the newspapers indicates more of a rhetorical support. So lots of poetry is written. There's even a group of women who raise funds to erect a Grecian cross on the Brooklyn Heights to show their solidarity with Greece. But I mean, how much help is a cross in Brooklyn Heights helping the Greeks in a real way? So I'll speak more about how we end up seeing the transition towards more of a humanitarian effort by 1823. So the movement soon took on more of an organized direction with leaders calling for donations. Again, this is by 1823. Eventually, New York is going to be identified as the central collection point. How about American Philhellenic leaders? Who is actually bringing this movement together? And that credit goes largely to Matthew Carey of Philadelphia and Edward Everett of Boston. But who were they? Edward Everett was perhaps the most central Philhellenic leader in early America. And frankly, it's his efforts in the Philhellenic movement that makes him have a national notoriety. Just 26 years old at the outbreak of the Greek Revolution, Everett's Philhellenism was especially influenced by his German education. He is one of the first Americans to receive a degree from Europe, his doctorate. He studied classics. I actually kind of enjoy Everett, and he actually traveled to Europe with his friend George Tickner. The two of them tried desperately to be taken seriously as scholars in the German classical tradition, but they realized that they're just not going to cut it. I've got some letters from George Tickner here for you. Tickner noted that the German professors had convinced him that in America, quote, "We do not yet know what a Greek scholar is, nor even the process by which one is made." His friend observed of Everett, who really gave it his all to be the best of the best amongst his classmates. Tickner noted that at one point, Everett looked like he had, quote, fasted on 6 months of Greek prosody and Pindaric meters. He was just like wasting away practically because he's so focused on his studies. Everett was first inspired to become a Philhellene when still a student at Harvard. In 1814, Everett gave an oration at Cambridge titled "The Restoration of Greece," reflecting his budding enthusiasm for the Greek cause and his increasing desire to tour that region. So this is before he even heads over to Germany. Byron's Childe Harold, this is the great poem by Byron, was a favorite of Everett's and undoubtedly influenced his perspective on Greece. In fact, the young Everett had his copy of Childe Harold signed by the author when on a visit to London. Everett admired Byron's adventures in Athens, supported his opposing opinion on the subject of Lord Elgin's effort to remove the Parthenon marbles from Athens, and was even given letters of introduction to go on his own trip to Greece by Byron himself. So he gets it right from the horse's mouth, if you will, in terms of gaining this enthusiasm for Greek independence. Everett spent more than a month in Greece. So he's one of the few early Americans who actually goes to Greece. He was in Athens for 2 weeks alone. And it's during this time that he marvels at the antiquities and the ruins in Greece, and he decides he wants to take this enthusiasm back with him. As a professor of Harvard, he will also give public lectures on ancient Greece. So he really had a pedestal to inform the public about all of the wonderful things that he had seen in Greece. Matthew Carey has a little bit of a different origin. He was born in Dublin, Ireland in 1760, and at a young age, he entered into the publishing industry. So he is a publisher from the get-go. He was a Catholic. Carey criticized the treatment of Irish Catholics under British rule by printing and distributing pamphlets. He was then, of course, threatened by prosecution by the British for doing this, so Carey had to leave Ireland for Paris in 1781. It was in Paris that Carey met Benjamin Franklin and became his apprentice. Carey accompanied Franklin to Philadelphia in 1784 and quickly became a noted and well-connected printer. He was also a bookseller, philanthropist, and political economist. Carey fully embraced his American citizenship and lauded the achievements of the American Revolution. Though not specifically a Philhellene, or at least not in the same class as perhaps Edward Everett, he was still a well-known philanthropist in his time, and Carey's reputation was an important element to the success of the Greek Fund in Philadelphia. So he is very important in organizing the Greek Committee in Philadelphia. Because of his notoriety, he was able to attract other notable figures from within the community. So these two men organized committee efforts in Boston and Philadelphia, and they are going to coordinate at a national level for raising funds and ultimately sending them to New York, which is identified as sort of the National Philhellenic Committee. How did early Americans hear about the Greek cause and actually stay engaged? How is this possible in an age before mass transportation and communication? Well, the answer is newspapers, and I've been referring to newspapers quite a lot already. The newspapers are always my go-to, although there are debates about, to what level can we really ascertain a public opinion from newspapers. I have found that the sheer number of times a particular article is printed and reprinted, how far away is it reprinted? I think that that's a pretty good indication of at least the level of engagement that people have or interest that they have in reading about certain events. So newspapers are where we're going to see advertising by these actual committees at the local level. It's going to be reporting on what they're doing. So this is, of course, informing the public. that a committee has met. Perhaps it's going to generate interest in maybe increasing membership. I've just selected a few. There are literally thousands of these newspaper articles like this. In fact, if you look at early American newspapers from, I'd say, the summer of 1821 all the way up through the 1820s, you're going to be hard pressed to find one newspaper that doesn't have an article about the Greek Revolution in some capacity. And sometimes there's lots of different articles. So this is an article that is talking about the committee in Philadelphia, their efforts to raise supplies, resolutions that they have passed. This one's interesting because it actually says that they have a warehouse that has been set aside for the reception of articles of food and clothing. Please note, this is from 1826. So this is when things have shifted more to towards that humanitarian effort, which again, I'm gonna trace that in just a bit. Still another article. This is from Hartford, Connecticut, talking about yet another committee and their efforts to raise money and interest. And then, were they in the know in terms of what was actually going on in the Greek Revolution? Were they interested in that? And the answer is yes. There are, and how are they hearing about this? Usually this is going to come through merchants who are making their way from Greece. News will travel that way and then eventually make its way to the US, and that news will be printed. Is it always reliable information? No. But the fact that it is being printed in these newspapers and on a national level, that would suggest that there is an interest in following what's happening. This article is just a segment talking about what's happening at Nafplio and Missolonghi. So I chose it because it mentions specifically civilians. So disconsolate widows and weeping orphans meet you in every street and alley soliciting alms. Thousands who are excluded from the city dwell under the castle of Napoli in huts composed of reeds, which but ill serve to screen their inmates from the rains and burning sun. And so a report like this would further generate interest in raising funds, and likely one reason why it was printed. So how long did the movement last? And did it change over time? Is it totally static? And as I've been alluding to, no, it wasn't static. It absolutely changed. Sorry, I'm having a tech difficulty. There we go. So how did it change? There are, and why? There are a number of reasons for why there's a transition. This initially is because of the lack of interest that the US government had in officially recognizing Greek independence, or at least that's my belief. It could be coming simultaneously from several different avenues. So on the one hand, Philhellenic leaders perceived that they would more likely be able to engage a broad base of interest, especially from women, if they directed their efforts toward the Greek populace rather than the military. So it's a little controversial to ask women to go door to door and ask for money for weapons, but it's less controversial to say to women, no, we want you to support orphans and poor widows. So it's possible that that's one reason why the shift happened, and there are letters that indicate that was a reason. But there is also evidence, on the other hand, that American agents in the Mediterranean directed members of the Monroe and Adams administrations to discourage public support of the Greek army if they desired to successfully negotiate a trade agreement with the Ottoman Empire. So there's a political element here. With this in mind, President Monroe and later President Adams advocated for neutrality in the Greek Revolution in favoring of advancing a strategic foreign policy. John Quincy Adams, while Secretary of State, certainly made it known to pro-Greece members of Congress that the executive branch would not support their foreign policy plans. With Everett's close connection to government officials, it is possible that the government's wish that Philhellenic societies redirect their efforts towards civilian relief helped shape the American Philhellenic movement in the final years of the war. So my sense in seeing the sources is that it's coming from a few different directions, but again, we definitely see this shift by 1823. So what's going on in 1823? Why the shift? So first of all, 1823 is when Lord Byron joins the Greek army. Early Americans, of course, take notice of this. They're very interested. In fact, there's even articles in newspapers saying, well, the Greeks really have a leg up now because Lord Byron's with them. Of course, references about the pen is mightier than the sword and all that sort of stuff. But they're thinking, oh, great, Lord Byron's with them. That's going to help. But there also was this expectation that maybe we don't have to raise lots of money because surely of all the revolutions taking place, the United States will support this one because we have such an intense connection with the Greeks. Again, this perceived notion, but that is not to be. And here's what happened. So Monroe's 7th address to Congress, and this is in December of 1823. It is primarily remembered for outlining a foreign policy that came to be known as the Monroe Doctrine, where he warned European powers against new colonization in the Americas. However, Monroe also addressed the policy concerning European affairs, including the conflict in Greece, stating, "A strong hope has been long entertained, founded on the heroic struggle of the Greeks, that they would succeed in their contest and resume their equal station among the nations of the earth. But ultimately, Monroe says, we aren't going to support Greece. We wish them well, and we will acknowledge them when they have independence, but we will not support them now." And there was a national outcry. I mean, people are devastated. They are shocked. And so the general feeling is, well, if the government's not going to do anything, then we, the American people, need to do something. And people are so shocked, in fact, that there actually is pushback within Congress on Monroe's decision. And by the way, James Monroe really wanted to support the Greeks. In fact, it's possible that it took so long for the government to actually say, no, we're not going to do this, because Monroe was really holding out. And John Quincy Adams kept telling him, no, we're not going to do it. And I think Monroe waited until he absolutely had to make a statement. So days later, on December 8th, Daniel Webster, a member of Congress from Massachusetts and ardent supporter of Greek independence, responded to Monroe's statements by proposing that an agent be sent to the US government, or by the US government to Greece. Webster's proposal offered up the possibility of the United States recognizing Greece as a free nation and raised the question of direct assistance to its war of independence. Congress addressed the proposal in a series of debates beginning on January 19th, 1824. So probably January of 1824, it's the height of this engagement over the Greek question. Webster proposed, he wants an agent sent. He wanted Edward Everett specifically is named as the person that they want to send to Greece as the official American agent. And ultimately, nothing's going to happen. Webster's speech just ends up stirring up discussion and debate, and the result is total political gridlock in Washington. Representative Samuel Breck of Pennsylvania wrote to a friend in January of 1824, in the midst of all of this, complaining that public and private business in Congress is, quote, postponed to make room for idle debates in relation to the Greeks, who are no more entitled to our money or sympathy than the Hindus. end quote. Even Joel Poinsett, who was, and this is the guy on the right here, Joel Poinsett, who as a young man dreamed of traveling to Greece. He never quite gets there. He gets to Italy and sees some of the Greek ruins in southern Italy. He similarly is going to complain about those who supported the Greek cause, stating, "Nothing, in my opinion, can be more absurd than a romantic statesman, and I am opposed to chivalry in politics." In fact, Poinsett is asked specifically by John Quincy Adams to kind of be his go-between on getting this issue tabled, which is pretty much what happens. It just dies. Nothing's going to happen. So support or opposition to the Greek cause does not appear to have been a specifically partisan issue. Men from both sides of the aisle supported and opposed the cause. Those who did not support Webster's resolution generally supported independence for Greece, but either favored neutrality in European affairs or desired to cultivate a trade relationship with the Ottoman Empire, and therefore saw supporting Greece as counterproductive. Although I will say, probably a majority of James Monroe's cabinet, for example, wanted to support the Greeks. So it's kind of John Quincy Adams against everybody else, and he prevails on that question. Then on top of everything else, Lord Byron dies at Missolonghi in 1824. So we actually see another resurgence in interest in the Greek cause by mid-1824. There are tons of letters written by constituents to their congressmen. These are preserved for us, where they're expressing frustration. Their congressmen have no choice but to write back, the executive has decided we're not going to move forward with this. So at the end of the day, the American people decide, well, we want to support the Greeks. So I guess we're going to have to do this from the grassroots level. So to what extent was the Greek cause this grassroots movement? Much of my research focused on looking into what exactly people did at the local level, what kind of efforts did they make. So I'll provide you with some examples. The Periclean Society of Alexandria was a literary group that's mostly elite men in Alexandria. They got together, read each other poetry that they wrote. It wasn't necessarily an activist group at all, but in the midst of Monroe's address to Congress, Webster giving his speech in Congress, they all of a sudden have kind of this awakening, if you will, and they actually transform their group into an activist Philhellenic group. And they organize, I guess I should say they solicit donations. They organize speeches to be given on the subject of ancient Greece, Greek independence. And all of this was done around Washington's birthday in 1824. There's lots of great quotes that I came across where they reported about how adult groups as well as children raised money, sent it to the Periclean Society, all with the idea that they're all united in this venture to send aid. But the Periclean Society, we have to acknowledge, is more of an elite group. These are men who are certainly literate. They have the time to spend on organizing stuff like this. So to what extent was the average early American engaged in supporting the Greek cause? And the fascinating thing is, it was very predominant, actually. And so I have for you, again, I apologize, I'm asking you to read a bunch. I'll just point out some things. And I realize that the text isn't the greatest, but these are just some of the nuggets that I found that were just so exciting. So on the top, this is an article reporting that a barber in Troy, New York, had pledged that he would give the money that he earned from a particular day. It's on Thursday and Friday last He would send it as donation for the benefit of the Greeks. Down below is the Washington Hose Brigade. So this is, firemen that decided to send $50 to support the Greeks. And you see the language that they use, very similar to other Philhellenic groups. The Greeks are our brothers, both in a political and in a Christian point of view. They worship the same God and they cherish the same free republican institution. So yes, it was overwhelmingly a grassroots movement, and it would not have been possible without the widespread interest that it generated. Just a couple of other examples. There was a society called the General Society of Mechanics in New Haven, Connecticut, who also raised $50. They handed those funds over to the local Greek committee to be sent to Greece. Members of a number of different churches devoted to the Greek cause also are going to mobilize. Of course, their efforts are also printed in the newspapers reporting how much money they raised. One Methodist church in New York collected $112 in just one evening in January in 1824 alone. And then in terms of what sort of ethnic groups are engaged in all of this, it likely was mostly an effort by whites in the US, although I did come across at least one example of men and women of color who had thrown a benefit for the Greeks. So this is a New York paper. It reported that free ladies and gentlemen of color had given a benefit for the Greeks in March of 1827. Though it is not clear if Philhellenism was an influential movement within the African-American community, they certainly understood the desire a group of people could have for freedom. And this would be sort of in line with also the fact that Haiti is one of the first nation states that recognizes Greek independence. According to the report, these ladies and gentlemen were enthusiastic enough over the benefit that, quote, the company did not disperse until 6 in the morning. So they partied all night in support of the Greeks. There's also lots of pop culture references in the period. Again, I mentioned that poetry, literature, what have you, was probably the mainstay in the early couple of years of the war, but that continues through the 19th century. This is one of my favorites. This is a page from music that was actually based upon a popular poem called The Song of the Greek Amazon. It is about a young Greek maiden whose fiance is killed by the Ottomans in battle. And as a result, she decides to join the Greek army and becomes a Greek cleft. So here she is depicted in uniform and is going to go serve on behalf of Greek independence. So I love this element, the illustration, and again, there's this interesting engagement on like gender roles. I'll speak a little bit more about that in just a moment, but generally, that kind of public engagement would have been sort of frowned upon, the idea of women serving in the army. But it seems that early Americans are okay with this and can wrap their brain around such an instance because of the circumstances, because this young woman's fiance has been killed. And again, going back to the notion that Greek women would be enslaved by the Ottomans because they're in a state of rebellion. This, from the early American perspective, this was an acceptable thing for this young woman to do, to defend Greek independence. So the United States government decides not to support the Greeks, and in the end, the Philhellenic movement in the US is almost entirely a grassroots effort. So what did early Americans actually send to the Greeks? Actually a lot of stuff, and it took on a bunch of different forms. Clothing. Women actually made hundreds and hundreds of articles of clothing for the Greeks. They had sewing circles. That's all they did at certain periods of time, producing clothing. They sent food. They sent supplies. They, of course, sent money. Initially, in the early years of all of this, they collected at the national level at New York, and then it's sent to London and sort of organized under the London Philhellenic Committee. It comes out that those funds are mismanaged. And so Americans are insulted and upset that this has happened. So they determine that they themselves are going to send the aid to the Greeks. They also are very focused on, they want the Greeks to know that they are in this struggle with them, that they wholly support them, body and soul. There is an incident that takes place that's known as the Greek frigate scandal. There were officials from the Greek government who commissioned the building of some ships, 2 ships from New York shipbuilders. It ends up being a total debacle. The ships, the cost of them just sort of spiral out of control. These Greek officials are horrified at what has happened. It all goes public of this incident that's taken place. The American public is mortified. They feel that we're responsible in part for the suffering Greeks. They aren't getting the ships that they need. There are calls on the American government to gift these ships to the Greek government. This does not happen, but the closest that the government comes to openly supporting the Greeks in their revolution is one ship is purchased for the US Navy, which then allowed the Greek officials to purchase the other ship. So that ship is going to head on over to Greece. Rumors, and in fact, the Ottomans are outraged over this. They believe that the ship is laden with Americans who are bound for Greece to serve in the army. It did have supplies on board, but that's the closest the American government gets. They sort of do them a favor, but don't actually gift the ship itself. To what extent did the Greek cause enjoy national support? And what's the proof there? So George Newbold, the Greek Committee of New York's treasurer, received donations made by individual citizens, both locally and nationally. And he kept amazing records. And these are at the New York Historical Society, by the way. Hundreds and hundreds of receipts with names of people that actually donated to the Greek cause. So it's a great resource. Several residents of Virginia in 1828, for example, sent their personal donations to New York. A struggling businessman and resident of Richmond named Hezekiah Belden, and again, sometimes the actual names are in there, and then any letters that accompanied it. A native of Connecticut whose business brought him to the South wrote to Edward Everett requesting that his donation of $10 be forwarded to the Greek Committee in Philadelphia, New York, or Boston, as you shall see advisable, is what he says. Belden explained to Everett that in Richmond, something is said, but nothing is done for the cause here. Would to God that less was said and more done, and that benevolence did not dwell upon the tongue alone. That Everett forwarded the donations to Newbold suggests that even the American Philhellene of Boston saw New York as the central collection point. Other examples, there is a resident of Stanton, Virginia, who requested that his $5 be handed to a proper person for the Greeks. He wished to remain anonymous, so his name's not given. Another Virginian by the name of H.M. Thompson donated $66.38. And again, remember, this is the 1820s. $5 would have been a lot of money. $66 is pretty sizable. Maybe he got a collection up locally. He doesn't say, but that is possible. So although many Southerners supported the Greeks, they did not form as many groups or organizations to aid the cause as Northerners did. This does not appear to be a point of difference based on sectionalism, but rather stem from the fact that the North offered more organizational opportunities in its urban centers than in the more rural South. While there were certainly exceptions, these receipts indicate that Greek aid societies were primarily active in urban centers in the North. So does that mean that the issue of slavery prevented the Greeks or prevented Southerners from supporting the Greeks? That does not seem to be the case. And there seems to be a disconnect in that regard. And again, I believe that is based on the fact that Southerners perceived the Greeks as being whites. This is an example of white enslavement, and therefore they obviously are against that. They're slaves of African extraction. That was different in their minds. So how did grassroots interests sustain this level of engagement for almost a decade? How did they do that? Many of these Greek committees they sponsored American Philhellenes in Greece. There actually were Americans who went to Greece, served in the army, most notably Jonathan Peckham Miller and Samuel Gridley Howe of Massachusetts. Samuel Gridley Howe, a member of a well-established Boston family, was a recent graduate of Harvard in medicine. He was also influenced by Byron. Howe desired to follow in the heroic poet's footsteps. He assured his father that what he actually was after was medical and surgical experience on the battlefield. And actually it kind of makes me laugh a little bit just thinking about this young man trying to convince his dad, no, really, Dad, I want experience, real world experience. But yeah, I kind of want to go for these other reasons. I'm a Philhellene at heart. Miller, Howe, they actually traveled back and forth between Greece and the US at times. They gave public engagements. They spoke about the situation that the Greeks were in. They especially are focused in that humanitarian effort. So raising aid. They actually discouraged people from coming and serving in the Greek army. They said that it would be better if you organized at the local level and sent aid. William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist, supposedly considered going to Greece and serving in the army. He ultimately decides against it, but Will, as Howe requests, focused his efforts at speaking about the Greeks, speaking about the enslavement of the Greeks and raising aid. Miller, and I don't have an image of him, Miller actually tried to influence the political outcome in Greece. He had an audience with Alexandros Mavrokordatos, and he is not at all sanctioned by the US government to have this conversation, but he says to Mavrokordatos, just so you know, Americans will support you all the way through this. But if you end up wanting a monarchy, we're out. This is basically what he says. We want you guys to have a republic. And Mavrokordatos assures him, of course we want a republic. But I mean, the reality is there already were conversations being had about the British coming in and being a part of that conversation. So there's some political wheeling and dealing there. But Miller is essentially a non-state actor. He is trying to affect a particular outcome out of the war. So they very much had influence. They are reporting this. His letters are printed in newspapers. So Americans would have felt, or at least had the ability, as we can't say for sure what Americans would have felt about these, but they had the ability to see what these Americans were doing and what sort of aid was needed to assist. On the right here, just really quickly, this is a narrative by a Greek who comes to the US. It's about his experiences in the war, how his family is captured by the Ottomans. He's ultimately trying to raise money to find where his family is located. How Miller and others actually brought some Greek orphans back to the US, and ultimately they will remain in the US and become US citizens. So it's a varied effort in a lot of ways in terms of supporting the Greeks. And then how about women? And I know I've been speaking for a long time, so I'm gonna try to abbreviate so we can get to Q&A. Women on the basis of this idea that women could only be engaged in matters that had to do with the home. As historians call this, it's the domestic sphere. So how can they be engaged then in supporting a revolution halfway across the world? How would this be even remotely appropriate? Benevolent societies and church groups were engaged in helping at the local level for providing aid to orphans, destitute women. And so by extension, the Greek cause becomes a part of that. And they see these women in Greece as being, in a lot of ways, part of their community. So it is totally socially acceptable for these women to be engaged in a public way, trying to raise funds. And in fact, I mean, they went door to door in some cases. They're out there raising money for the Greeks. And again, it's considered acceptable because it's considered to be a domestic matter. From that, as I argue in my book, women end up being able to use this as an avenue to continue to have an interest in those sorts of matters on an international scale. So women involved in helping to start schools in Greece, for example, missionary efforts. Again, that would have been appropriate socially for women to be engaged in. But again, we have to acknowledge that it's some way they're stepping out of their box, but it's okay because of how they are couching it in terms of part of their domestic sphere. I should have flipped to this sooner. This is a benevolent society poster. Famous women like Lydia Sigourney of Connecticut, who is a member of a Greek aid society and was a nationally known poet, wrote about supporting the Greeks. Her letter that is sent to Greece along with a bunch of supplies tells the Greeks about the efforts that they've made. I want to read you just a small part of her letter because again, we get that sense of this community engagement. So she says, "The poor among us have given according to their ability, and our little children have cheerfully aided that some of you and your children might have bread to eat and remnant to put on. Could you but behold the faces of our little ones brighten, while they give up their holidays that they might work with their needles for Greece? Could you see those females who earn a subsistence by labor, gladly casting their mite into our treasury and taking hours from their repose that an additional garment might be furnished for you?" So again, she is an elite, but she is giving us insight into the idea that her Greek committee does have women from lesser means very much engaged in this effort. And were the Greeks aware of American support for their revolution? Yes. There are letters that come back from Greece. These are also printed in newspapers. One missionary in particular, a guy named Jonas King, writes back home and says that he was in a little village in Greece. I forget if he says which village, but he's in this little village. He says that people are very much aware that he's American. They're excited that he's there. They're excited about what they're hearing about the Americans supporting the Greek cause. And he says that at one moment, toasts are being given. And for about 3 to 4 minutes, the crowd of Greeks that were assembled there gave a cheers for American women for their singular effort at supporting the Greeks. So I fear that I've spoken for longer than I planned. So I will stop. But if anyone has questions about the legacy of all of this, how did it change the conversation in terms of reform in the US? We can certainly do that. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Maureen. I'm sure there'll be many questions. There have already been many positive comments in the chat, but I wanted to start off by asking you a question about the role of universities in promoting this Philhellenism, especially departments of classics, because so many of the people you mentioned had gone to Harvard and other universities and had been trained essentially as classicists. And how did that connection, that tight connection through the language to Greece's past, actually help feed this kind of fervor to support the Greeks at this time?
Yeah, so of course, there are Philhellenic groups within a number of universities. The students of a lot of these schools become engaged. Right as you asked the question, what came up to my mind was actually an example that maybe you wouldn't expect. There was a university in Kentucky that actually was engaged in supporting the Greeks, and there was a female, not seminary, but a female institute that was sort of connected with the university, and they were engaged as well. So not just the usual suspects that you would see from, you know, like Harvard, but even out in places like Kentucky, we see that engagement and effort to organize local efforts.
And I guess the flip side of that question is, what did people in the US know about the actual players in the revolution? For example, did women know about Laskarina Bouboulina? Was she a model for this story about the Amazon? Or do people know about Kolokotronis? So were these heroes in Greece, did they make it? Did their fame make it to the United States? And did those stories help inspire donations, or was that too far away and abstract for people?
So probably more often than not, it's Greece is referred to in that romantic sort of reference, with reference to the ancient. Pericles is mentioned quite a lot, for example. But yes, but I have to say, to a lesser extent, there are, some of these Greek revolutionaries are mentioned. Laskarina Bouboulina is mentioned, which is really exciting for the project that we're working on now. She is known as the Greek heroine. And I think of any out of any of the revolutionaries, she's probably going to be the one that people would recognize by name, just based on what I saw with her references in newspapers.
Are there any other questions from listeners? We have comments about a superb lecture. April Householder's here. She might have some comments to offer. I think your fan club is present today.
Oh, good.
A question. Did Southerners continue to support Greek independence even after it became linked to the abolitionist movement?
It's such a great question. And in fact, when I was in the revision process for the book, one of the readers is a very well-known author. His comment was, I don't believe that there wasn't some conversation about slavery here. Like, there's no way that Southerners would have supported this in the same level as Northerners. And the answer is, they did, though. There was this disconnect that, and again, I suspect that it's based on race, that the Greeks are white, that it was an acceptable cause to support, and there seems to be no conflict in their heads about supporting the Greeks as opposed to eliminating slavery within their own realm. Later on, when the abolitionist movement uses the rhetoric of the Greek cause to advance their arguments, but we have slavery, how can you guys support the Greek cause if we have slavery here? And Southerners really don't even dignify it with a response. It does not compute.
Great. Other questions? I see Jim Barakos is leaning up in his chair.
Thank you, Sharon. Were there letters of thanks from the Greeks to the American benefactors for the work that was done?
Yes, and I was trying to find one to provide as an example, and I could not find it. I've got it somewhere. It's the letter I was looking for is sent by a Greek woman who was working in a hospital, and she writes saying, the supplies that you sent benefited these people, and thank you for being so mutually into this conflict. And so yes, there were maybe a lesser extent than women, but also letters from, and I mentioned Mavrocordatos, other Greek, provisional Greek officials would have been known, and those letters are sent. Lyriotis is another one. So yes.
Excellent presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, I think you've given us so much to think about. I personally have benefited so much from this lecture, so richly illustrated, and so many sources to think about. I mean, I feel like we should all be running to the Library of Congress at this moment to the topic. So I want to say to the people gathered here, we return in January with exciting lectures in collaboration with the Benaki Museum, including one on Papadopoulos biscuits, and one lecture on the painter Theophilos, which we will hold in collaboration with the Theocharakis Foundation, also in January. So I'd ask you to please consult our website for titles and also to RSVP. So on behalf of our center, I want to wish all of you a very happy and fulfilling Thanksgiving. And let me express once more our gratitude to the amazing Professor Maureen Santelli for her excellent lecture, and to Ambassador Papadopoulou for her stalwart support and friendship, and especially to all of you who've been to so many of our lectures in 2021. I know we're all looking forward to a brighter year in 2022, and I promise you our center is going to fill it with many, many wonderful things, very exciting things to come. So Maureen, Santelli, you're amazing. Thank you, and please keep researching Greece, because these Greek-American connections are so interesting to all of us. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great afternoon.
Excellent. Excellent talk.
We'll see you soon.